Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this lecture, one of many events that have been scheduled to celebrate and welcome Dr. Samuel L. Stanley, Jr., an accomplished educator, medical practitioner, and researcher, as the 5th president of our university. Before coming to Stony Brook, Dr. Stanley served as the Vice Chancellor for Research at Washington University in St. Louis. He received his BA from the University of Chicago and his MD from Harvard Medical School. He completed his internship and residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and moved on to postdoc work in immunology at Washington University. Thereafter, he was appointed to the faculty in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Washington University's Medical School, one of the nation's highly ranked schools of medicine. He has an outstanding reputation as a distinguished medical researcher and has published extensively. Under his leadership and guidance as Vice Chancellor for Research, Washington University's sponsored research funding reached nearly $600 million annually. While Dr. Stanley has impressive credentials in medical research, those of us who have worked closely with him over the last few months are equally impressed with his understanding of and his commitment to all of the elements that make a university great. He embraces the totality of the academic enterprise, from lettered disciplines and arts to sciences and medicine. He will lead Stony Brook's efforts to build upon the foundation of critical relationships that we have with Brookhaven National Lab and Cold Spring Harbor to help us achieve our next generation of successes. He is an articulate, thoughtful, deliberative, and strategic in his approach. He embraces a leadership and a management style that empowers people to do their jobs. This is a very exciting time for Stony Brook University, and I'm sure you join me in looking forward to Dr. Stanley's tenure and are confident that his presidency will bring many new and forward-looking opportunities to our institution. Thank you again for joining us in celebrating this historic occasion for our university and our new president, and it is now my pleasure to welcome President Stanley to the podium.
Well, thank you so much, Brent. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is one of the many stops that I've had during this inauguration marathon, as I've called it, and I'm really beginning to feel like it's a marathon, I have to say. But every time I come to one of these events, I get energized and excited about all the wonderful things that are going on at Stony Brook. And so each stop has really been part of a great education for me about the campus. You know, as I looked at the job when I first talked to the search committee about Stony Brook, I really knew some of the basics. And you know, and I knew both, I think, some of the very positive things about the school as well as some of the things I think that we need to work on and improve. But this past 5 days or so, when I really had a chance to hear from faculty, we've had some remarkable distinguished faculty present on their work, when I've had a chance to see some of the creative things that are going on from our students, both in the world of research as well as in artistic creation, when I've had a chance to travel to some of our different campuses and see the energy there as well, has really been, I think, wonderful for me. So, but I'm here today to do one of the things that as I said before, that I've been enjoying the most, and that's hearing about the research of our faculty. And you know, this is one of the things I miss. One of the things that happens to you when you become an administrator is, unfortunately, you don't always get to hear lectures from faculty and so on. So it's wonderful for me to be able to come from my office across the street and actually hear about some science or about literature or whatever the topic is. So the title today, our talk is going to be by Clint Rubin, and the title is Engineering and Intervention for Osteoporosis and Obesity. And I think no department on Stony Brook's campus, I think, has been more involved in the translation of basic applied science into commercially promising technology than our Department of Biomedical Engineering, which is chaired by Dr. Clint Rubin. Under his leadership, the Center for Biotechnology has been really a driving force behind the establishment of New York's bioscience industry. And there's really, you know, one of the things we're doing constantly and going to be doing in the future, I think, is going to the state and saying Stony Brook is absolutely critical, as is SUNY to the future economic development of our state. And it makes a wonderful argument when we have people like Dr. Rubin who really are translating research discoveries into something that actually benefits people. Dr. Rubin's own work is targeted towards understanding these cellular mechanisms responsible for the growth, healing, and homeostasis of bone. More importantly, this work focuses on how biophysical stimuli, mechanical, electrical, temperature, magnetic, pressure, etc., mediate these responses through the control of mesenchymal stem cell differentiation and proliferation. And the clinical significance of this work is really applicable in the inhibition of osteopenia, the promotion of bony ingrowth, and the acceleration of fracture healing. And I'm seeing firsthand the positive components of the acceleration of fracture healing. My wife, Dr. Ellen Lee, who came, had been in Long Island no more than 2 days, and when she went out running, twisted her foot, fractured her 5th metatarsal, was in a cast. It hasn't healed well. She's now receiving one of the bone stimulators, and so you know, I'm really hoping this thing works. I really am. So we'll see. But all of his goals have been approached via interdisciplinary studies at the biochemical, molecular, cellular tissue, organ, and computational and clinical levels, and he's used a number of different approaches. He's had recent studies that have looked on how to reverse osteoporosis in children with cerebral palsy, how to help recover bone density in osteopenic young women, and preventing osteoporosis in postmenopausal women. He's also been able to show recently that low-level mechanical signals actually can bias mesenchymal stem cell differentiation towards osteoblastogenesis, in other words, bone formation, and away from adipogenesis or fat formation. So using these signals on animal models of diet-induced obesity, it's clear that these mechanical signals can actually inhibit the formation of fat and at the same time build up bone density, and that sounds like a wonderful thing, I think, for many of us if that actually could come true. So Dr. Rubin is a fellow of the American Institute of Biological and Medical Engineers, a recipient of the Presidential Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation, 2 Kappa Delta Awards from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, the John Charnley Award of the Hip Society, the Fuller Albright Award from the American Society of Bone and Mineral Research, and the Giovanni Borelli Award from the American Society of Biomechanics. His work is currently funded by the NIH, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the Whitaker Foundation, private industry, and the New York Office of Science, Technology, and Academic Research, NISTAR. He holds more than 22 patents, with 14 pending in the area of wound repair, stem cell regulation, and the treatment of bone disease. He's also the founder of a company, Exogen Incorporated, now a subsidiary of Smith & Nephew Incorporated, and Juvent Incorporated, a startup focusing on osteoporosis treatment. He received his BA in physiology from Harvard University and a PhD in anatomy from Bristol University in Bristol, UK. I'm very delighted now to introduce the distinguished professor and chair of our Department of Biomedical Engineering and director of the Center for Biotechnology, Dr. Clint Rubin.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon to hear about the research that we do in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, specifically, or more specifically, about bone. Before I launch into that, I would like to welcome Dr. Stanley to Stony Brook on behalf of the Department and Center for Biotechnology. We certainly look forward to working with you to sort of build up the university and help fulfill your vision. 2 other points I'd like to raise. I'm thrilled to see so many biomedical engineering students here. Just so you know, I was kidding when I said that if you didn't show up, I'd be on your defense committees. It's actually not really true. And then finally, before I start, I did want to point out that it's really sad when the faculty beat the students once again in soccer, but that stuff, you know, you just got to live with it as you go. Let's see if I can get this going. So let me tell you a quick story about the title of this. It actually started off exactly like this, starting with my transition from a bonehead to a fathead. My wife and my son both thought it was a brilliant title and indicative of me perfectly. Our provost office had the good sense of actually erasing this part, not knowing that I'd put it up again. But they did actually try to change the title by saying changing the world. engineering and intervention for osteoporosis and obesity. But I assure you that the things that I'm going to talk about are sort of more looking down the road, things that I'm not really sure I know what I'm saying, et cetera. And I will also say, it's not so much that the president's here. I've had my fair share of tussles with presidents in the past. They don't scare me at all. It's much more that when I give a talk at a university or at a meeting, et cetera, I can always say, I'll say what I want because I'm leaving tomorrow. And in this case, I'm not quite so sure I can get away with that. So what I'm going to try to do is create a connection between a disease of the elderly, osteoporosis, and I'll define that as we go, and actually some work that we're doing in our lab group now, which focuses more on the etiology of juvenile obesity. And it's not often you sort of think of this sort of disease that plagues the young and the pandemic that faces the elderly, how they're actually connected, but I'm going to try to do that here. Just because I always bug students in biomedical engineering about making sure that they encapsulate the problem. I'll try to do that here. That in essence, we're talking about a $20 billion per year disease right now, osteoporosis and all the fractures that follow with it. But by the time you get to 2050, in the US alone, it'll be a $250 billion a year disease. So it's really a major impact in terms of health and society. The scarier bit for those of us who happen to be 20 or 30 is that by the time 2050 comes around, the incidence of fractures going around the world is going to rise very, very rapidly. So the issues of bone health, bone quantity and quality are really central to thinking about how to deal with bone loss. Up here, what we've got are micro CT scans, or these really high resolution X-ray scans from humans. This is called trabecular bone. It's the spongy bone within the dense cortical bone, the shell. You see in a 20-year-old female and a 70-year-old female, really there's less of it. The material that's there isn't 70 years old. It happens to be 3 or 4 years old because it's turning over all the time. There's just less of it. So you can imagine that for a given load, a given mechanical demand, it won't actually serve as good a structure as something that's more robust in the younger generation. It's important also, and as I try to connect this to obesity, to think of osteoporosis, or the fractures that come with it, are not simply a bone-related event. Bone is not the only culprit. It's more of a systems level problem. Here we've got a scan of the thigh, the mid-thigh, of a 25-year-old male and a 63-year-old male, of the same basically body mass index, the same height-weight ratios. But what you see here is something called sarcopenia, the wasting of muscle. So that in essence, the muscle mass, as it's basically dissolving away, is replaced by fat. So not only is there more subcutaneous fat, but the fat's actually infiltrating the tissue as well. Right? So the quality and quantity of muscle is basically decaying in real time. And here, in some work by K.S. Leung from Hong Kong, shows that as you age, it's not only the amount of muscle that dissolves away, but the type of muscle. And in this case, type 2A and 2B fibers are specifically the first to go. And if you think about it, just as we age, we have a greater tendency to fall over, to be less stable, that this is going to become important in this argument that I'm going to try to make as we move forward. And then because it's fun, and because I have worked with NASA for so long, I thought that I would remind you that it's not just lack of bone density or muscle strength that really plagues you in terms of fractures, but as President Stanley's wife just points out to us so well, that in reality, it's as much a tendency to fall. So here we got a lunar mission on Apollo, and in essence, these people, as they go up and they're walking around the lunar surface, tripping over rocks, etc., I mean, it's amazing to think about that a Colles fracture, a fracture of the wrist, or a femoral neck fracture, something that can really actually put you at risk, can't be treated at an emergency room down the road, right? So as we move forward and trying to think about obesity, to show you that I adhere to compliance issues in this picture of basically 1 in 3 children that are obese. This is me in the center, the sort of the spherical one here. It's my brother. It's my brother and sister along with me to sort of play out the nurture and nature elements that basically I would eat anything put in front of me. So basically it was, let's say, intake exceeded the burn rate or my exercise level. I didn't really do much as a kid except sort of sit around and eat a lot. The point of these slides here, though, these maps that came out in the CDC, Center for Disease Control, last year, really shows how scary this problem is. So this is actually a map of childhood, children being overweight or obese, starting in 1985 and going up by basically, let's say, 10-year intervals, by decade intervals. And you can see that the incidence starting with the light blue at less than 10%, to dark blue, to dark blue, where we've got 15 to 20%, and even to the dark orange, by the time you get down to 2008, essentially it's plaguing the entire country. So you can see that really it's a problem that's escalating across the country. And when we think about it worldwide, you're dealing with over basically over 1 billion adults are overweight, 300 million adults are considered obese. The prevalence of obesity tripled in the last 30 years. Okay, so these are really scary numbers, right? Particularly when you think of there are very, very few interventions for obesity. So this is sort of, with that platform, I'd like to sort of launch from here into why I think they're connected and then try to convince you that perhaps they are. So as we just pointed out, osteoporosis, $20 billion a year, 50% of women over the age of 65 in the US are at risk of fracture or having low bone density. Obesity and sort of its sequelae and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, it's an issue of about a $200 billion per year problem, okay? And that we're talking about 30% of Americans are currently considered overweight and obese. The scariest bit is the highest increase in the youngest ages. So now you go to your physician and you're overweight. What does he or she tell you? He says, well, you should go out and exercise, right? And those of you with low bone mineral density, you go to your physician. What does he or she say to you? You should go out and exercise. And you sort of wonder, well, this is just sort of this standard response or reflexive response of a physician to, well, you know, exercise cures all, or are they actually connected in the end? And once you get past genetics and nutrition, which obviously influence your susceptibility to both obesity and osteoporosis, what I'm going to actually focus on are their common stem cell precursors, the mesenchymal stem cell. This is basically where your bone cells come from and where your fat cells come from. Okay? So here's actually a diagram of it. This is basically, it's not actually not that complicated. You start on your left with the mesenchymal stem cell, the progenitors. They turn into, or they differentiate into pre-osteoblasts or osteoblasts, or they have the option of becoming pre-adipocytes, pre-fat cells, and then fat cells. Okay, pretty straightforward, pretty easy. And those of us in the bone world that think about how mechanical loading builds up bone, we tend to think of loading up the resident cell population, right? It makes sense. If you're going to build up bone, you tell your bone cells that are around, hey, you better start forming bone. So we've tended to focus on slamming down on osteoblasts and bone lining cells to get them to adapt and grow as a way of stimulating bone formation. I'll also point out that mechanical signals suppress bone resorption, or these big thug-like cells, these osteoclast cells that chew away bone. All right. So how does mechanical loading really start to fit in this? How can we tune these signals? And starting basically here with our astronaut core. This is data from Tom Lang a couple of years ago, where he looked at mere astronauts and Skylab astronauts that basically these astronauts are losing about 2% of their bone per month from the hip. And this is incredibly scary when you take it in context that we all peak our bone mass around the age of 35. We lose about 2 to 3% of our bone per decade after that, except for women, 3 to 8 years during the menopause. Following the menopause, they lose about 2% per year. So when you start to think about a 3-year round trip to Mars, losing 2% of your bone per month, you know, it gets a little scary. You know, that these guys or these female or male astronauts may not have much bone when they land onto the Martian gravitational field. The other side of the equation, we've got Roger Federer here. Professional tennis players have about 35% more bone in their humerus than the arm that simply throws the ball into the air. And in deference, I know that we have an infectious diseases physician with us, the humerus, that's this bone here, just so that you know, okay? But basically, what that's telling us is that bone has the ability to focally sense mechanical loading and adapt to the challenges, okay? In the negative sense and in the positive sense. But the question becomes, you know, what is it that's really driving this response? And so what we do, or what we have done in the lab, is we go around sticking these little engineering transducers onto the surface of bone to see how they actually deform with functional loading. Right? So in this case, we have this little strain gauge. This is about 2 millimeters across here, to give you a sense of scale. And it's on the 3rd metacarpal of a thoroughbred racehorse. So basically, it's stuck to this bone so we can see how the bone deforms under really strenuous activity to try to get a sense of the challenges that it sees. And you could see that, you know, that while the foot is through what's called the swing phase, there's not a lot of strain going on. When it impacts, it begins to deform, okay? So that is what strain is. You apply a load, and the material essentially deforms and distorts, okay? Don't worry about it too much. I'll just try to put it in context of where I'm going with this. This is a range of animals that we've looked at here, sort of from horse down to a fish and a monkey, et cetera, et cetera. And here we've got a range of strains. And again, don't worry about the actual amplitude, except notice that they're all very similar. They're 2,000 to 3,000 microstrain, okay? And so the strain here, this is on the humerus of a barnacle goose as he's flying across the lab, 2,000 to 3,000 microstrain. Basically, here we got 2,800 microstrain while this animal is flying across the lab. Just as evidence that to the students that are here, I have actually been in a lab before. There I am there. There's Brigitte Demis, who I see out in the audience. This is our subject here who's leading us forward. We have a strain gauge attached to his tibia, and we're looking at strain, right? And basically, you can, any vertebrate that happens to show up, the femur of a turkey before Thanksgiving, the operculum of a pumpkin seed sunfish while he eats a goldfish, right? That basically the mechanical demands made on cranial bone. And here is my son Jasper a few years ago. My wife Jenny wouldn't let me put a strain gauge on his tibia, but I would probably guess that it would be on the order of 2,000 to 3,000 microstrain, okay? So that's 0.2 to 0.3% strain. Don't worry about the units so much, except when you look at this is one complicated slide that I will show you, which shows here on this log-log plot how much mechanical information you have to put into the skeletal system to maintain it, right? That's what we're wondering about, right? And we're going to treat astronauts or postmenopausal women or kids with cerebral palsy. How much mechanical information do you have to put into the system to maintain it so your skeleton outlives you? And here on the y-axis, what we've got, remember we've got 2,000 to 3,000 microstrain, which is right here, this green star. What you see from, this is data from decades ago, shows that you need very, very few cycles of loading. So basically, you know, it's jumping off a chair 4, 5, 10 times a day is enough to actually tell your skeletal system that things are okay. You shouldn't resorb away. And so we in the lab sort of decided, well, there must be a fall off, right? Because if bone is this optimized tissue responding to mechanical signals, and the peak strains are 2,000 microstrain, you'd think, well, anything below 1,000 microstrain bone wouldn't really care about. But what we found, following this sort of blue and gold path coming down here, that basically you could trick the system into being adaptive. That you could do it with 100 cycles per day of 1,000 microstrain, about the strain that your tibia sees while you walk, where 2,000 microstrain is what you'd see when you run. And then getting down here really into the noise with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of really, really small cycles on the order of 10 to 100 microstrain was enough to keep the system turning over and running, right? What we found, though, is if you start loading up bone at 100,000 cycles per day, and if you load it at 1 cycle per second, 100,000 cycles takes a long time. So we thought we'd just sort of compress the information, squeeze it together. And what we found was actually at first quite odd. There's you increase the frequency from 1 hertz, 20 hertz, 30 hertz, 60 hertz, bone became more and more responsive. Which at first was odd. I mean, we don't typically think of ourselves as running at 30 cycles per second. But then you think about all these other physiologic systems in your body that pick up exogenous signals, right? The way you see color, the way you hear change in tone of voice. Pacinian and Meissner corpuscles all have frequency windows, 10 to 100 hertz. Why not bone? So it began to make sense, just some sort of teleologic fluke, that bone was responsive to these higher frequency domains. Until you actually ask the muscle what's going on. So in this case, we take another little engineering transducer called an accelerometer, and we basically tape it over the skin, over the soleus muscle, and we listen to how noisy the muscle is while somebody is asked to stand. So we say, stand as still as you can, and after a while they start sort of wobbling back and forth, and your synergistic antagonistic muscles are keeping you upright. And what this is something called a fast Fourier transform, a graph that's not as a function of time, but a function of frequency. And what you see in this 27-year-old female is there's a lot of mechanical information, a lot of noise in the system between 20 to 50 hertz, right? It's sort of like when you pick up a coffee cup in the morning or a beer in the afternoon. But basically, your muscles are very noisy or very inefficient motors. So all that time that you're really standing up, and we think of it as a static signal, that in reality our muscles are bombarding our skeleton with these higher frequency domain signals. It's just bathing. So rather than thinking of it as necessarily running to a bus stop, maybe walking for longer periods might actually be helpful in the end. The problem with this is if you do the same experiment with an older female, 73 years old, exactly the same thing, the same microphone, et cetera, that in essence, this mechanical information dissolves away. Remember, we started this by talking about sarcopenia, muscle wasting, and we talked about type 2A and 2B muscle fibers dissolving away preferentially. And the consequence of this is that as you're standing, a signal that we think is important in defining your bone morphology, right? Because we don't all go out and run marathons each day. We tend to stand around, but our skeletons aren't so bad, that as we age in this sarcopenia, this mechanical information disappears. So, if bone is responsive to higher frequency domains, and as a young, healthy adult, and we're standing around, basically those muscle-based signals are defining your bone morphology. What happens as you age and your muscle disappears is that regulatory signal disappears as well. So what we try to do is to put the signal back into the system. And I put this picture up because it's really my favorite anecdote that I can come up with in terms of my travels around This is me. This is the turkey. This is a photograph that came out in National Geographic in celebration of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It came out in January 2001. I, of course, was very excited by this because, you know, it's my favorite scientific journal, National Geographic. Get your picture in it. That's cool. My mom, of course, points out to me that the caption actually says, Dr. Rubin, parentheses, right, and his subject, left. You know, sort of brings you back down to earth. But the great story is I happened to be in Chicago when this came out. It hit the newsstands, and I got into this plane, and I got onto my favorite seat, which happens to be an exit row window. And I'm sitting there, and the plane begins to fill up, and this gentleman sits one seat away from me in the aisle, and he gets down, and he pulls out, of all things, this National Geographic. And I think, wow, this is kind of cool. I wonder if he'll, you know, connect the dots. And he's sort of flipping through like this, and he comes to this picture, and it's sort of this 2-page thing. And he looks at it, and he looks over at me, and he closes it, puts it in his briefcase, and he changes his seat. So it's absolutely true, and it's just like, whoa. So that was sort of a long lead-in to how we put in these really, really small signals to drive the bone response. So again, we're back to our friend, the strain gauge, right? That's measuring deformation. If I had a strain gauge on this placard, as I deformed it, it would basically pick up that strain. So now we have strain gauges on the tibia on this turkey, and you can see, as you might imagine, just like us, we sway. We sway at about 1 cycle every 2 seconds, or half a hertz. You could see that the sway magnitude causes strains on the order of 20, 30 microstrain. Very, very small. Remember, we're thinking of peak strains as being 2,000 microstrain. Here on top of this, we're now going to take this little plate and we're going to buzz it. We're going to shake this back and forth. So in essence, while the animal's standing there, we're going to put in what we think is sort of a pretty heavy-duty muscle signal that causes very, very small strains in the bone. And what we saw in this was, of course, pretty exciting, at least to us, is that we look in these adult turkeys, you know, thanks to NIH, they allow us to raise, you know, 4-year-old turkeys, that in essence, there's very little bone formation in the control group, right? Basically 2 to 3% of their bone is turning over, just like us as adults. But as we begin to shake the plate more and more and more for 10 minutes per day, we actually turn these bone surfaces on. So really, without using drugs, we're going in there and telling the bone cells, hey, this is a mechanical challenge, you should adapt. But in reality, the turkey's just standing there, not actually doing anything. And this was exciting. And then moving on from bone formation, remember I started off by saying mechanical signals were important to bone resorption. Those of you that are familiar with bone disease know that there are FDA-approved drugs for either stopping resorption, anti-resorptive drugs, or anabolic therapies like parathyroid hormone. But it sort of doesn't really take advantage of the bone system that we've been talking about here. What we see here is the red dye. It's called TRAP staining, tartrate-resistant acid phosphatase. This is a growth plate of a rat. And where the red dye is where these bone-eating cells are very, very active. Oops, sorry. That there's a lot more red dye here than here. And these guys were basically these rats that were buzzed for 10 minutes a day. So this mechanical signal is sufficient to not only stimulate bone formation, it also suppresses bone resorption. That's all interesting, particularly if you happen to be a bonehead like me, but ultimately if you want to translate this into the clinic, you have to learn lessons that we learned in things like fluoride treatments of bone, where you can increase bone density, but the bone quality diminishes, such that fluoride diseased bone, fluorapatite bone, can actually lose its structural properties. So before we could do this in humans, we needed to demonstrate that over a long period of time, the bone would actually grow and it would be stiffer and stronger. So basically we take these sheep, and you see they line up as volunteers, and we have an active group and a control group. They're fed their breakfast every morning as an incentive. We do not pay these guys. And that each day for a year, 5 days per week, we buzz them very, very gently, barely perceptible mechanical signal, to see if in this elderly animal population we can build up bone. And what we found, these are basically sugar cube size, 1 centimeter cube pieces of bone from the medial femoral condyle, that here you've got in our control animals. You could see how the structure of bone isn't all so bad, but the experimental bone shows that they're actually going from rods into plates. They're becoming structurally more sound. And that when you go and you mechanically load up these bones and you test them, you can see that they're stiffer and stronger. And this is stuff that's a little over my head, but my colleagues Yishen Chen and Stefan Udex basically have straightened me out on mechanical loading of bone, and I'm very fortunate to be collaborating with them in this regard. So let's get into humans now. If I'm going to argue to you that these signals are very, very small, barely perceptible, that might be interesting biologically, but the problem becomes, how does it translate up to the regions of interest, the hip and the spine? Right? Could this possibly be relevant? So we went over to Sweden and we stuck pins in people's spines and in their hips, and we put these accelerometers on that basically can look at how much mechanical information from this slightly vibrating plate is transmitted up to the hip and to the spine, right? That's the challenge. And what you see was pretty encouraging to us. Here we've got this sine wave, this nice smooth wave going back and forth, the acceleration and deceleration of the plate at 0.2 g. 1 g is what basically glues you to Earth. So it's a very small signal. And you can see in the dotted and dashed line that about 75 to 80% of the mechanical oscillation from here travels as a wave up to the hip and spine. So we're able to deliver this. Now I'm going to make one slight detour here before getting to the clinical trials, and that is, particularly because my president is here, I have to declare a potential conflict of interest here. As he pointed out, I get mixed up in too many entrepreneurial things, for better or for worse. And one of them is we have started this company called Juvent, because we saw, wow, this is great. We've got a non-drug therapy for osteoporosis, perhaps. The problem is that when we published this stuff, and we were protected by our tech transfer office here, that all these other companies came in and started saying, well, stand on this paint shaker, or stand on this and that and the other thing, because it'll do the same thing. One of them, probably the most famous one that Madonna and Sting both use, is the power plate device, that this red wave here, you can see here acceleration is in g, so it goes from minus 5g to plus 5g, around 10g at its lowest signal, at its low setting, right? 10g, there's Madonna. Sean Puffy Combs uses it as well, I understand. And here is the device that we're trying to get through hospital boards as safe to treat the frail elderly or kids with cerebral palsy. Now it turns out that vibration is typically studied as a pathogen. Lots of truck drivers, helicopter pilots, that sort of thing, suffer a lot from low back pain. So NIOSH and ISO, these international safety organizations, come up with thresholds for occupational exposure to vibration, right? Makes sense. So the question is, how much can you safely be exposed to for how long? And so what we've got here is our device is safe by ISO standards for up to about 4 hours per day. And in our frail elderly trials, we asked people to stay on the device for 10 minutes per day. So we say this is pretty safe. Now in terms of Madonna, what we've got is it's a nonlinear function, right? Here's the bandwidth that's basically considered safe for less than 1 minute per day. You can see going from here 4 hours to 1 minute And then you sort of think about the New York Times and what you see about percussive injuries to the brain in football players, right? Repeated low-intensity collisions. That basically, it's not the collision that basically blows you away. It's the deceleration of the brain away from the brain case. Causes all sorts of entanglements, et cetera. White finger disease, blurry vision, loss of hearing, et cetera, et cetera. So as we move forward into clinical trials, and if you believe anything that I have to say, then please, if you run into one of these devices in your gym, approach it with great caution. You know, you can put James Bond's martini on it, you know, shaken, not stirred or something, but I would not stand on it. So clinical trials. We'll start our first clinical trial dealing with kids with cerebral palsy. They have a very, very high risk of fracture in the proximal tibia. We're using CT scans to basically look at what's called volumetric bone mineral density of the trabeculae within basically this region right here. This is where physicians who treat these kids are most worried about keeping the bone around. And in this trial, it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. It's very small, and it's basically lasting 6 months. We ask these kids to stand on this device for 10 minutes per day. What we see was, you know, just sort of like startling and encouraging at the same time. Using these CT scans, we see that these kids that were in the placebo devices were losing 9 to 10% of their bone volume in their proximal tibia in 6 months. So basically, the bone's just dissolving away in real time. It's kind of scary. In the active cohort, the kids that stood on the device, that not only were we maintaining bone, it was anabolic to the bone, showing this sort of this 17% swing. And this is important because a kid with cerebral palsy, a disabling condition where these kids are not moving around, their bone cells are fine, right? They're just not being challenged. So our argument here is that we mechanically challenge them, we stimulate them, and they would respond. And this was very, very exciting to us. We then moved into a controlled trial with young women with osteoporosis. So this is in collaboration with Vicente Gilsons. The previous one was Zuf Mughal at Manchester in England. This is Vicente Gilsons at Children's Hospital of LA. We recruited a group of 48 young women, 16 to 20 years of age, all of whom are in the lowest quartile of bone mineral density, and all of whom had at least one fracture from osteoporosis. And basically, we did the same study. We asked them to stand on the device for 10 minutes per day. And what we saw, and this is what's called intention to treat data, so we're including everybody regardless of compliance. What we see, as any pediatric radiologist would tell you, is that in this cohort, Tanner stage 5, basically we don't see much change in cancellous bone density of the spine. But in the buzzed young ladies, we actually see a significant increase in bone density. And for those of us in the bone world, you know, to see a 3% anything is pretty exciting, right? So we thought, wow, this is kind of neat. And we then look at basically the mid-shaft of the femur, dense cortical bone, right through here. And we see a very sort of similar kind of thing. We see a 3% swing in intention to treat data, the control group, and the buzzed women showing this, if I may say, a benefit or an augmentation of bone. Where we sort of had this aha moment, is we turned around and said, well, wait a second, because we use CT scans to look at the spine, we could also look at the musculature. So looking at the paraspinous musculature in the buzz group versus the control group, we were also seeing that the muscle was increasing in cross-sectional area. There was not only more bone, there was more muscle. And where does muscle come from? It comes from mesenchymal stem cells. We thought, well, maybe what we're doing is not necessarily buzzing the bone, but buzzing the recruitment of cells to the musculoskeletal system. And this is what's called now per protocol analysis. So when we send these data to the FDA to try to get a claim for a device or for a drug, you send them both intention to treat and per protocol. What you see is that basically, if these women used the device for at least 2 minutes per day, it was no better than 10 minutes per day. But if they used it for less than 2 minutes per day, it was no different from control. So we took the 18 women out of the 24 who were compliant for more than 2 minutes, and we looked at them in the green bars, and the non-compliant group and the controls we looked at in the red group. And what we saw was basically bone density and muscle area significantly increased over control. But remember, we're using CT scans. We also saw visceral adiposity, fat, actually remain at baseline levels in the young women who were buzzed, but increase in visceral load or visceral challenge in the controls. So we thought, aha, this is where our transition, our lab group and some of my colleagues have sort of made this evolution from boneheads into fatheads, which is sort of the second part of this, where we're basically using exactly the same device, buzzing them away. Here are mice, and we're basically colorblind under this. And what we've got is the signals these animals see on the order of 2 to 3 microstrain. Remember, peak strains being 2,000 microstrains, so we're 3 orders of magnitude lower. And we're going to see if we can influence adiposity, the increase of the fat burden in these animals. And as people in our lab group know, this is probably the most distressing data I'd ever seen in my life, that basically what we were seeing in the buzz, the green, and the control, the red, that as they were going through on this regular diet, that basically their body mass was increasing right on top of each other. So that's clearly a failed experiment. And here in food intake, basically they were identical as well. And well, there's no way this experiment ever possibly could have worked. But then, what we were able to see is we take these in vivo CT scans at very high resolution, and we erase away the muscle and the bone and the skin and leave only the fat. So it's signal specific for fat. A little algorithm, not little, a big algorithm. But basically, this is the torso of the mouse, the regular diet mouse, and the regular diet mouse who is buzzed for 15 minutes a day for 3 months. And what's happened here is that this animal has basically 30% less fat here than its control. Saying, wow. And we knew that these signals couldn't possibly be large enough to be burning off fat, right? We're not arguing that we're changing the intake. We're saying we're influencing the differentiation of these stem cells. And I'll try to support that in a second. So what we've got in these mice is we're exposing them to very, very small mechanical signals as they're growing, and we think we're telling the stem cells to bias their differentiation to become bone cells. But if there's a finite number of bone cells, or a finite number of stem cells, and they're all becoming bone, what they can't do is they can't become fat. That was sort of what we were arguing. And so we took this experiment, and this was Kim Liu, a graduate student in the lab, did this work. It was really lovely work, where basically she lethally irradiated the experimental group. So basically they would pass away unless they had a bone marrow transplant to save them. And the bone marrow donors happen to be GFP, or green fluorescent protein positive mice. So anything that goes into the bone marrow is labeled green, and we can track it then over time. And here, in this short experiment, the previous one was 12 weeks, this is now 6 weeks. You can see even 6 weeks later, we have less fat pad mass, less fat pad volume, and we have fewer adipocytes, fewer fat cells, right? So this seems to be working. Where it became kind of puzzling to us, and we still admittedly haven't figured it out, is that the mesenchymal stem cell number, not only were they more oriented towards bone, there were more of them. So within the bone marrow cavity as we're looking at it, or in the torso as we're looking at the phenotype, the fat, we're changing the fat phenotype and we're changing the viability of the bone marrow itself. As we're also trying to make the connection to diabetes, we look at indices, in this case triglycerides, we see in fat tissue, in muscle tissue, and in liver. Basically, we suppress levels of triglycerides and levels of free fatty acids. I'm not silly enough to stand in front of you and argue that we are mechanically driving down the biochemistry of triglycerides, but more that they're correlated to the fat burden. So the less fat you have, the less risk you have with evil things like triglycerides. Whoops. So let me just back this up. So we submitted this, and it got published in a great journal and got lots of press, et cetera. But we also got hassled by a lot of people, study sections, et cetera, saying, gee, that's it's a great parlor trick, but what happens if you go in and you really challenge the system? What happens if you feed these guys a high-fat diet and actually drive them towards obesity? So in this case, I don't know if you could see it. Let me just lower this a little bit, if that works. So in this case, what we've got is where all the BME students leave, that what we've got are animals fed a high-fat diet. And in this case, we see the bone, the spine, obviously, and some of the ribs. But the red is fat. And you can see the buzz guys versus the control guys is that there is, in this high-fat diet, this diet-induced obesity model, there's markedly less adiposity. And just as we would hope, there are lower levels of adipokines, right? The things that basically drive adipogenesis or fat formation, leptin, adiponectin, and our triglyceride loads are down and free fatty acid loads are down as well. So this was pretty exciting. This became kind of important from a paper that came out in a journal FASEB about 2 weeks ago that showed that people with larger adipocytes, fat cells, are at greater risk of diabetes. And this is in biopsies of humans. Here is the fat histology from the buzz and the control guys. And the adipocyte volume is actually smaller in these buzz guys. And that got us thinking that if basically the fat infiltration was suppressed by this mechanical loading, then really what haunts you in obesity is the adiposity infiltrating the major organs, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. And in this case, in a paper that's coming out in the International Journal of Obesity in a couple of months, I guess, right in 2010, in collaboration with our Department of Pathology here, we looked at liver sections with Ken Troyer. And what you see is here's the liver section of the buzz guys that ate basically the identical food load as the control guys, but basically these vesicles of fat are not infiltrating the liver. Again, we don't think that we are mechanically suppressing some morphology of the liver. It's just by keeping the fat burden down that the liver tends to work in a very, very different way. So we're arguing that things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease could perhaps be suppressed by mechanical signals. Of course, because we're trying to make this connection between suppressed fat, gain bone, that here, again with micro CT scans, this is the tibia, the proximal tibia, so what we see is we see more overall bone volume in the animal, more bone volume in the tibia, and for the biomechanics people out there, we see that the bone is a better structure. So in essence, what this is saying is with these mechanical signals that are barely perceptible, and we think we're actually stimulating the progenitor population, that we are driving them towards bone and therefore inhibiting them to turn to fat. And so where are we now? This is work we're tripping over ourselves every day because we don't quite understand it. But basically in this flow cytometry or FACS analysis, we're looking at basically where stem cells are going. And we see in this case, in this FACS analysis, that at 6 weeks and looking at the bone marrow, we see that they have, by staining them with these antigens like SCA1 and PREF1, we can identify the stem cell pool, that we can see we have more of them, and they're more driven towards osteoblastogenesis. Final slides. This is where we begun. With our mesenchymal stem cell, same graph. What are we thinking now? You don't need to bang the system. We can tickle the system, right? This is supposed to be a feather tickling the cell, in case you didn't figure that out. I worked on this all day. That, in essence, that what we think we're doing with these mechanical signals is upregulating the number of stem cells, and we're biasing them down an osteoblastogenic or a bone formation pathway. I didn't talk about the molecular cues, but basically things like RUNX2, which is a transcription factor specific for osteoblastogenesis, is up markedly. So we're stimulating the formation of osteoblasts. At the same time, transcription factors for fat formation, PPAR gamma, are markedly suppressed. So in essence, without drugs, we're going in and we think we're modulating the bone and fat phenotype by biasing not the resident bone cell population or the fat cell population, but their progenitors. So as you are growing, or in case of bone, as you're turning over, you can basically convince the progenitors to do the right thing and make the right decision. So in essence here, at the same scale, is a high-fat diet guy. There's a salami slice right through the torso, where the red is visceral fat. Same experiment, except in the buzz guys, much less fat, but a lot more bone. So we're taking these mesenchymal stem cells and we're mechanically driving them to a specific fate. So just in the last slide, if you didn't understand a word that I said, fair enough. My entire scientific life can be summed up in this cartoon that came out by Sylvia that talks about buzzing mice. So in 2 cartoon panels, that's what I do. And these are the great people that I have the opportunity to work with, in particular Stefan, Ishen, Kim Lu, and my sister Janet. Thank you very much.